Welcome to this edition of Ethical Articles. Each week, listeners will have the opportunity to hear an audio version of selected articles from Carnegie Council's team of experts. This week, Nikolas Gvosdev reads his article, Ethical Tensions of Track 2 Dialogues and Cluster Munitions.
This past week, political leaders were forced to confront ethical dilemmas around two aspects of the ongoing Russian invasion of Ukraine, both of which expose the tension between the ethics of an action versus the intended impact of the action. The first concerns the propriety of former U.S. government officials meeting with Russian officials in the context of a Track 2 dialogue. The second concerns the ethics of the U.S. supplying cluster munitions to Ukraine, even though most countries around the world ban their use. News reports revealed that earlier this year, a group of former senior U.S. officials traveled to Moscow to hold what is known as a Track 2 dialogue, meetings where former officials and experts can dialogue about contentious issues and explore possible solutions without committing their governments to any formal actions. These Track 2 meetings subsequently became Track 1.5 when the U.S. delegation met with current Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov and other sitting Russian government figures. Subsequently, U.S. government officials were also briefed on the talks. When governments are unable to engage in direct, frank diplomatic dialogue or do not have relations, Track 2 meetings can create the space for discussion and move beyond a recitation of official talking points. But concerns were immediately raised as to whether even a Track 2 dialogue between U.S. and Russian interlocutors in Moscow undermines support for Ukraine, and whether such a meeting was an effort to explore a settlement that would fall short of declared U.S. and certainly Ukrainian objectives and conditions, especially around the question of Russian control of territory universally recognized to fall within Ukraine's internationally recognized borders. The question of whether Americans should be meeting with officials of a government engaged in aggression against a neighbor and where charges of war crimes have been made also featured in the criticism. Defenders of the Track 2 meetings note that the American participants made clear that they were attending in personal, private capacities and were not negotiating on behalf of the U.S. government. Instead, they would provide the results of their conversations to the Biden administration, which would then decide whether any initiatives merited further discussion. But critics argue that holding even unofficial back-channel meetings undercuts stated U.S. positions and encourages Moscow to think that things that the U.S. says are non-negotiable are, in fact, negotiable. Yet if the U.S. and its allies are unwilling or unable to provide everything Ukraine needs for achieving those objectives, or feels that other competing imperatives, including avoiding escalation, are potentially at risk, then having talks to see if the fighting can be brought to a close and other areas of tension reduced is worth the ethical cost of having the meetings in the first place. This follows Winston Churchill's precept that meeting jaw to jaw is better than war. Similarly, the decision to supply cluster munitions to Ukraine requires weighing the use of a weapons system that is known to leave behind unexploded ordnance that threatens the civil population, sometimes for years after a conflict has ended, versus the use of such munitions as a war-shortening or even war-terminating weapon to reduce the overall number of losses and destruction. Several U.S. legislators have argued that cluster munitions, because of the indiscriminate harm they cause, including mass civilian injury and death, cannot be used, even in the service of helping Ukraine defend itself from attack, and recommend other replacement measures. Other U.S. officials, while acknowledging the risk, see the Russian invasion as posing a much greater risk to Ukrainian civilians, and that using these weapons now will save more lives. Proponents of the Track 2 dialogues and supporters of the decision to supply cluster munitions to Ukraine both take an ethical approach that the purpose and intent of the action matters more than the ethical nature of the action itself. If a track 2 dialogue with Russia or a steady supply of cluster munitions brings the invasion, and with it the death and destruction that has come in its wake, to an end, then the action should be seen as justified. Others raise concern about whether these measures will be effectual and whether the breaking of norms on supplying weapons or allowing for back-channel dialogues is worth the cost.
Be sure to visit carnegiecouncil.org for free access to this article and other resources analyzing the most critical issues at the intersection of ethics and international affairs.